Austere, where the real story begins after the camera stopped rolling, the truth and TLC.
When you watch Sister Wives, you're watching a story, but you're not watching the system. You're watching carefully edited confessionals. You're watching holiday gatherings staged for lighting. You're watching property disputes reduced to digestible drama. You're watching emotional sound bites cut into cliffhangers. What you're not watching is the architecture that made the collapse inevitable long before the cameras arrived. Reality television is designed to follow conflict, but some conflicts aren't episodic. They're structural. And structural problems don't resolve with apologies, therapy sessions, or one dramatic sit-down. They unravel slowly. Behind the cameras, the real story isn't about who said what in a group text. It isn't about who stood too close to whom during a barbecue. It isn't even about who legally divorced whom first. The real story is about power distribution, and TLC doesn't show power distribution. They show reactions. They show tears. They show raised voices, but they rarely show the hierarchy that produced those reactions in the first place. From the beginning, the family was framed as functional plural marriage, a modern take, jeans instead of prairie dresses, cul-de-sacs instead of compounds. The narrative was simple. Love multiplied, doesn't divide. That tagline worked because it softened the edge of the practice. It made viewers curious instead of alarmed. But here's what rarely made it into the episodes in full context. Plural marriage only functions under one condition: stable hierarchy. In communities that have practiced it long-term, there is usually an unspoken rulebook, clear ranking, clear expectations, clear submission structure. When that structure is consistent, the system can remain intact for decades. When it isn't, resentment festers. On camera, we saw a family navigating jealousy and communication breakdown. Off camera, what was really happening was a gradual redistribution of emotional resources. Time is finite, attention is finite, affection is finite. In monogamy, imbalance is addressed within a dyad. In plural marriage, imbalance becomes competitive. The show presented the wives as equal partners, equal voice, equal input, equal standing. But equal is a narrative device, not a structural reality. If you pay attention to early seasons, you can see the difference between symbolic equality and functional authority. Who makes final decisions? Who sets the tone? Who absorbs emotional labor? Who is expected to adjust? The camera captures the dinner table discussions. It doesn't capture the private negotiations that happen afterward. The late-night conversations, the silences, the subtle reassigning of loyalty. And then there's production. Reality TV thrives on arcs. Redemption arcs, villain arcs, sympathy arcs. When marriages deteriorate, producers don't stop filming. They recalibrate the storyline. Instead of unity, the theme becomes independence. Instead of shared holidays, the theme becomes rebuilding. But the system itself, the doctrine behind plural marriage, remains mostly untouched, because that would require theological critique. And TLC is not a theology channel. So the show avoids the deeper question, is plural marriage inherently stable? Instead, it suggests that this particular family struggled, that framing matters. When a structure collapses, you can blame personalities, or you can examine the blueprint. Behind the cameras, there were financial pressures that rarely received. Full breakdowns, shared mortgages, legal divorces for adoption purposes, property investments tied to trust agreements. Those weren't just romantic decisions. They were structural shifts. When one wife legally divorced so another could marry him on paper, viewers were told it was for the kids. But legal status changes power. It changes inheritance. It changes medical authority. It changes leverage. That wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. and strategy alters hierarchy. The camera showed emotional reassurance. What it didn't show was how legal standing reshapes internal power dynamics in a plural family. Then came the move to Las Vegas. Then, Arizona. Each relocation was framed as opportunity or safety. But relocation fractures support systems. In tightly bonded plural communities, proximity reinforces cohesion. Remove that, and the emotional weight shifts more heavily onto the husband as central connector. If that connector falters, the entire system destabilizes. We saw arguments about houses. We saw arguments about lots of land. What we didn't see was this question fully explored. What happens when one wife becomes the primary emotional household? Plural marriage depends on distributed attention. If one relationship becomes dominant, the others don't simply feel neglected, they become structurally downgraded, and that downgrade is rarely reversed. TLC showed hurt feelings. They showed confessionals where wives expressed confusion. They showed frustration over pandemic rules and visiting protocols, but they did not deeply interrogate whether plural marriage can withstand exclusivity. Because exclusivity is its natural enemy. The pandemic arc revealed something critical. Control centralizes during crisis. Who set the rules? Who enforced them? Who was labeled compliant? Who was labeled resistant? The show framed it as disagreement about safety, but underneath it exposed authority lines. Plural marriage often describes the husband as spiritual leader. When that leadership shifts from consensus-based to command-based, fractures widen quickly. The cameras captured emotional reactions to those rules. They didn't fully analyze the authority structure behind them, and that's the pattern. We are shown the visible fire, not the wiring inside the walls. By season 20, what viewers are really watching isn't the fall of a romantic experiment. It's the slow exposure of imbalance that was always there. Some wives found independence. Some found new relationships. Some found distance. But what the show still doesn't directly address is this. Was the breakdown caused by personality, or was it the inevitable result of a model that requires one person to divide himself permanently? Behind the cameras, the narrative is simpler than the episodes suggest. When a system requires 4 adults to suppress exclusivity, and exclusivity eventually emerges, collapse isn't shocking. It's predictable, and predictable collapse doesn't make for romantic television. So instead, we get confessionals. We get edited pauses. We get reaction shots. What we don't get is structural honesty. And that's where the real story begins. Because behind the cameras, the most powerful force shaping this family wasn't love. It was allocation. Plural marriage doesn't just divide time. It divides emotional currency. Think about it. In a monogamous marriage, emotional investment cycles between 2 people. Conflict, repair, connection. It stays contained. In plural marriage, every emotional shift affects multiple households. If one wife feels prioritized, another feels displaced. If one child feels seen, another may feel overlooked. And when cameras are present, that imbalance becomes public record. Early on, the show sold the idea that love multiplies, that affection expands, that a bigger family means more support. But multiplication only works with abundance, and human attention is not abundant. There are 24 hours in a day. There are only so many anniversaries, only so many birthdays, only so many nights in a week. When the husband rotates between homes, affection becomes scheduled. Scheduled affection doesn't feel spontaneous. It feels rationed, and rationed affection creates emotional bookkeeping. Viewers saw glimpses of it, comments like, He hasn't stayed here in days. He spends more time there, the kids notice. But TLC framed these moments as jealousy. Jealousy is a convenient storyline. It individualizes dissatisfaction. It suggests insecurity. But scarcity is not insecurity. Scarcity is math. When emotional presence becomes uneven, wives begin adjusting behavior to secure it. Some withdraw, some overcompensate, some comply, some challenge. And whichever approach produces the most access tends to reshape the hierarchy. That's what the cameras rarely name. They show conflict. They don't show incentive structures. Over time, one household becomes emotionally central. That household becomes the default gathering space, the preferred holiday location, the consistent point of return. And once that pattern stabilizes, the others become peripheral, not officially, not verbally, but functionally. You can see it in body language, in seating arrangements, in whose opinion closes the discussion, in who the husband instinctively turns toward when laughing. These microsignals matter, and they accumulate. Plural marriage requires extraordinary emotional discipline to prevent exclusivity from forming. But exclusivity is human instinct. When one bond deepens more than others, the system destabilizes. The show avoided saying that directly. Instead, it leaned into interpersonal drama. She feels hurt. She feels betrayed. He feels disrespected. But behind those feelings was a shift in emotional gravity, and gravity always pulls toward center. Once that center locks in, equal distribution becomes performance. That's why later seasons feel different. The laughter is thinner. The group scenes are shorter. The confessionals are more defensive, because the illusion of equilibrium had dissolved. Now layer fame on top of that. Public validation changes internal power. When one wife becomes the face of sympathy online, she gains narrative leverage. When another becomes the perceived antagonist, she absorbs blame. The audience becomes a silent participant in the hierarchy, and TLC edits with that awareness. Sympathy drives engagement. Engagement drives ratings. Ratings drive framing. So certain storylines are amplified, others are softened. But what remains consistent is this. The emotional economy was imbalanced long before the divorces, and imbalance doesn't correct itself, it compounds. By the time separations happened, the audience felt shocked. But structurally, the cracks had been visible for years. One wife asking for equal time isn't just requesting fairness. She's highlighting a broken distribution system. One wife saying she feels unseen isn't exaggerating. She's describing scarcity. And scarcity, over time, breeds detachment. What TLC doesn't show in full are the long stretches between filming. The quiet weeks, the unrecorded arguments, the birthdays missed without a camera crew present. The emotional fatigue of performing unity publicly while privately negotiating distance. Reality TV compresses time. It edits months into episodes. But emotional erosion doesn't happen in confessionals. It happens gradually, off camera, in the accumulation of small disappointments. When one wife eventually leaves, the narrative frames it as empowerment. And it is. But it's also an acknowledgement that the emotional economy no longer serves her. Leaving isn't dramatic rebellion, it's cost-benefit recalculation. Behind the cameras, that recalculation likely happened repeatedly before it became public. You can hear it in the language shifts. Early seasons, we're a team. Middle seasons, we're working through it. Later seasons, I need. That shift from collective to individual language signals structural fatigue. Plural marriage depends on suppressing individual prioritization. When individual need becomes louder than collective identity, the model weakens. TLC shows the announcement. They don't show the years of internal negotiation preceding it. And here's the part rarely spoken aloud. Once exclusivity is visible, it cannot be unseen. If one relationship becomes monogamous in practice, the plural model collapses emotionally, even if it remains technically intact. That's what viewers were watching. Not sudden betrayal, gradual centralization. And centralization is incompatible with equal pluralism. The show didn't explicitly say that, but the body language did. The pandemic accelerated it. Isolation sharpened proximity, and proximity deepened one bond more than the others. After that, repair would have required radical redistribution, and redistribution requires willingness. Behind the cameras, willingness appeared uneven, so the exits began, and the audience called it drama. But structurally, it was gravity. By the time viewers reached the later seasons, something felt different. Not just the relationships, the tone, the pacing, the framing. Because behind the cameras, there isn't just a family navigating plural marriage, there's a network protecting a brand. TLC didn't just document a lifestyle, it helped normalize it. In early seasons, the framing was careful and intentional. The Browns were presented as the relatable exception, not a compound, not prairie dresses, not isolation. They were suburban, approachable, modern. The message was subtle but powerful. This isn't what you think it is. That framing matters. It separated this family from more extreme fundamentalist groups. It created psychological distance between the audience and the word polygamy. It softened public reaction. But here's the reality of production. Reality TV isn't raw footage, it's narrative construction. Producers decide which conversations become episodes, which conflicts become arcs, which pauses get music underneath, which reactions are replayed in slow motion. Editing shapes empathy. If one wife is shown crying alone, viewers bond with her. If another is shown rolling her eyes, viewers judge her. But raw footage rarely lives in isolation. It lives in hours and hours of context. We see minutes. Production sees months. Behind the cameras, interviews are filmed long after events occur. Confessionals are sometimes recorded with knowledge of how a storyline is already unfolding publicly. That hindsight subtly alters tone. What sounds spontaneous may actually be reflective. What sounds explosive may actually be condensed. This doesn't mean the emotions aren't real, it means the order we receive them is curated. When divorces began, the show faced a structural problem. The premise was plural unity. Without unity, what is the show? So the narrative pivoted. Instead of celebrating plural harmony, it began chronicling plural breakdown. Conflict replaced cooperation as the engine. That shift kept ratings strong. But it also changed the internal power balance, because once one wife leaves publicly, she gains narrative autonomy. She can speak without protecting the collective image, and that freedom changes the energy of the remaining relationships. Behind the scenes, contracts still bind participation. Legal agreements govern who can reveal what. Public statements are sometimes strategic. We rarely consider how legal frameworks intersect with emotional ones. When a family becomes a franchise, transparency becomes complicated. There are NDAs. There are negotiations over storylines. There are episodes built around reveals that were known privately long before filming. What TLC doesn't show is how much of the tension is amplified by the awareness of being watched. Imagine navigating marital fracture while knowing millions of viewers will analyze your facial expression. Imagine arguing about intimacy while cameras capture your posture. Performance creeps in, not necessarily dishonesty, but awareness. And awareness changes behavior. Some lean into vulnerability. Some guard themselves, some become more rigid. Because when the private becomes public, stakes shift. There's another element rarely explored: financial dependence. The show provided income provided stability, but income also incentivized continuation. When a marriage is struggling and a television contract depends on participation, the timeline of separation can stretch. Not because feelings aren't real, but because logistics matter. Mortgages, businesses, children is schooling, public image. Leaving isn't just emotional, it's contractual. TLC doesn't highlight that layer. They focus on interpersonal narrative. But behind the cameras, practical concerns often precede emotional announcements. Then there's audience perception. Social media became an external pressure system. Viewers comment in real time. They choose sides. They speculate. They amplify rumors. That external feedback loop seeps back into the family dynamic. When one wife trends as a hero, that changes leverage. When another trends as a villain, that alters public defense posture. No plural marriage in history had to withstand Twitter, or Reddit, or YouTube commentary dissecting every interaction frame by frame. The Browns weren't just navigating internal hierarchy, they were navigating public court of opinion, and that pressure magnifies every fracture. Behind the cameras, conversations likely included: how will this look? What will viewers say? Should we address it next episode? When narrative awareness enters family life, authenticity becomes layered, not fake. Layered, multiple truths coexisting: personal truth, public truth, edited truth. And then there's the question the show still rarely confronts directly: did the cameras preserve the marriage or expose its fragility? Sometimes public accountability stabilizes behavior, sometimes it accelerates breakdown. When conflict becomes content, resolution becomes less profitable than tension, not intentionally malicious, just structurally incentivized. Long-running reality. Shows evolve into ecosystems. Cast members become characters, conflict becomes currency, and personal milestones become season finales. Behind the cameras, producers aren't theologians, they're storytellers. They aren't tasked with evaluating whether plural marriage is sustainable. They're tasked with delivering compelling television. So when viewers ask, why didn't the show address the deeper doctrinal issues? The answer may be simple: because doctrine doesn't trend the way betrayal does. Because structural critique doesn't spark social media engagement the way confrontation does. But that leaves a gap. The show captures emotional fallout. It rarely interrogates the foundation, and that omission shapes public understanding. Many viewers conclude, this family failed. Fewer ask, is the model inherently unstable under modern conditions? Behind the cameras, that question lingers, because once exclusivity formed, once legal shifts altered hierarchy, once public narrative began rewarding independence over unity, the plural structure faced modern pressure it wasn't designed for. Plural marriage historically survived in tight communities with limited external exposure. Sister wives placed it under national spotlight. Spotlight changes systems. Secrecy erodes. Narratives diversify, and participants gain options they previously didn't have. Independence becomes viable, and when independence becomes viable, compliance becomes optional. That's a seismic shift. What TLC doesn't show explicitly is this: the very act of televising plural marriage may have destabilized it, because transparency introduces comparison, and comparison fuels dissatisfaction. When wives saw public support for autonomy, the emotional calculus changed. Behind the cameras, that shift may have been more transformative than any single argument. Plural marriage relies on collective identity. Reality TV amplifies individual identity. Those forces eventually collide, and when they do, collapse isn't scandal, it's collision. By the final stretch of the series, something subtle but undeniable had changed. The family wasn't just divided, the premise was. What began as a portrait of cooperative plural marriage had transformed into a chronicle of exit. And here's the truth that sits quietly beneath every late-season episode. The cameras could capture conversations. They could not capture consciousness shifts, because the deepest transformation wasn't explosive. It was internal. You can film a confrontation. You cannot film the moment someone mentally detaches. And detachment, not anger, is what ultimately dissolves long-term bonds. Anger fights, detachment leaves. Behind the cameras, long before official separations were announced, there were likely silent recalculations happening in private. Moments where a wife realized she no longer felt chosen. Moments where comparison turned into clarity. Moments where compliance no longer felt virtuous, it felt diminishing. Plural. Marriage depends on a shared belief that the sacrifice is meaningful. Once that belief weakens, the sacrifice becomes visible for what it is, and visibility changes everything. The show documented emotional outbursts. It showed tears, defensiveness, accusations. But what it couldn't fully show was erosion of belief. Belief in the system. Belief in the hierarchy. Belief that this is how it's supposed to be. When belief erodes, so does endurance. And endurance is the engine of plural stability. There's another layer the cameras couldn't quite hold. Children. As kids grow into adults, they reinterpret their childhood. They reassess dynamics. They compare their upbringing to peers. And when they do, they may ask questions their parents never did. Plural marriage doesn't just require wives to accept divided attention. It requires children to normalize it. But adult children don't process family the same way young children do. They notice patterns. They form independent judgments, and once the next generation stops romanticizing the model, its cultural continuity weakens. The show rarely centered that shift deeply. We saw glimpses. Adult kids choosing monogamy. Adult kids expressing distance. But the long-term effect of that generational divergence is massive. When a system fails to replicate itself through belief transmission, it slowly dissolves. Behind the cameras, there may have been conversations about legacy, about what remains, about what was worth it. And here's the paradox the show leaves unresolved. Plural marriage was presented as strength through unity, but the strongest moments of the later seasons came from individual autonomy. Viewers resonated with independent stories, new beginnings, personal clarity. Those arcs generated applause, not the preservation of the original structure. That audience reaction matters because it reflects cultural reality. Modern Western culture prizes autonomy. Plural marriage prioritizes collective hierarchy. The show attempted to straddle both. For a time, it succeeded, but tension between those values was inevitable, and eventually, autonomy wins. Not because it's louder, but because it offers emotional sovereignty. Behind the cameras, when one wife built a new life and thrived, it sent a message, not just to viewers, but internally. Leaving doesn't equal destruction, it can equal expansion. That realization alone is destabilizing for any system built on endurance. Then there's the question of love. The show asked repeatedly, was the love ever real? That's the wrong question. Love can be real and still insufficient. Affection can exist and still fail under structural imbalance. Compatibility can be genuine and still collapse under divided loyalty. The cameras tried to distill the collapse into moments of betrayal. But the deeper story is simpler. Plural marriage requires a level of sustained emotional equilibrium that modern life rarely supports. Add fame. Add financial independence. Add public scrutiny. Add geographic relocation. Add evolving gender expectations. The margin for equilibrium shrinks. Eventually, it disappears. And when it disappears, someone steps away. What TLC couldn't fully capture is the quiet relief that sometimes follows that step. The exhale. The return to singular partnership. The absence of rotation. The absence of negotiation for presence. The simplicity of being chosen daily, not by schedule, but by default. That relief doesn't make explosive television, but it speaks volumes, and that may be the most revealing part of all. Because when former participants describe their current lives, the tone shifts from defensive to grounded, from justification to certainty. And certainty doesn't need confessionals. It needs peace. Behind the cameras, that peace may be the most profound storyline, one that unfolds away from production timelines. The show may continue, it may pivot, it may rebrand, but the original experiment, modern, televised plural harmony, has fundamentally changed, and what remains isn't scandal, it's exposure. Exposure of hierarchy, exposure of scarcity, exposure of what happens when collective identity meets individual awakening. TLC showed us arguments. But the real story was evolution, not just of a family, but of belief, and belief, once questioned deeply, rarely reassembles in its original form. Behind the cameras, the collapse wasn't sudden, it was cumulative. And cumulative truths don't need dramatic music, they just need time. If this deep dive changed the way you see not just Sister Wives, but reality television itself, subscribe to The Truth in TLC. Because we don't just watch what's on screen, we unpack what holds it together and what quietly pulls it apart. Let me know in the comments what you want exposed next.